global powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu.
Somewhere Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems.
चुन चुन करके हिसाब लेना ये मेरी फितरत है.
Why should it be a problem if I'm smart enough to have multiple options? You should be admiring me.
भारत झुकने वाला भी नहीं.
The rise of India will be determined by India. It will be determined by our strength, not by the mistakes of others.
The old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy.
Hey guys, once again something interesting has happened. As always, President Donald Trump's tariff war doesn't seem to end. Now, this time it's the Canada-US trade dispute has suddenly become much more than tariff. In fact, it surprised me too. I thought that it's just tariff discussions, there's that eventually Canada and US will work things out. But there's something interesting going on in this whole thing. If you go watch Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech that he gave. So he says that US pushed demand that would interfere with Canada's ability to make its own economic and domestic policy decisions. So to me, this sounds like some sort of Venezuelan system or Venezuelan deal. What happened with Venezuela between US and Venezuela? The deal was that Venezuela will sell its oil only after American permission or whatnot. That I'm just saying it in a very crude way, okay? So, according to Prime Minister Mark Carney, the demand that the US was making was something along those lines. So the disagreements basically included, number one was Canada's ability to negotiate future trade agreements. Pay attention to what I'm saying, okay? French language and cultural protections and strategic industries and resources. And how much freedom Canada retains while reducing its dependence on the US. And according to US President Trump, he sees that many of these issues as legitimate parts of a trade negotiation. And Canada sees some of them as questions of sovereignty. Because US is by far Canada's largest export market, tariffs give the US enormous leverage. And at least in President Trump or America's mind, that is a leverage. Technically it is. But what exactly is going on? What are Canada's options? Let's talk about all that. Okay. And most importantly, how did a trade agreement that seemed to have appeared close to completion, it was very close to completion, suddenly turned into a fight over Canadian sovereignty? And in fact, when I learned certain things, then this is what I found, that it is a challenge. So what exactly happened? Let's talk about that first, okay? See, Canada and US has been negotiating reductions in tariff affecting autos, steel, aluminum, and other products, okay? And both sides were reportedly getting close to an agreement. But what happened is that at the last minute, certain things were changed by the US in the agreement. Okay, certain agreements, certain things were changed, things that I talked about earlier, right? And those were serious problems. They were major disagreements that emerged during the final stage of the negotiations. And that took Canada by surprise. So according to Canada says some of the final US demands went beyond tariff and market as in market access, and started affecting Canadian domestic and foreign economic policy, which makes sense to me at least. So Mark Carney pulled the Canadian negotiating team back rather than accepting the final terms, or rather than be like India and keep dragging these trade deals. Instead, he just put a lid on it right away. And he was like, all right, let's get this out. We are done. We are not going to negotiate this any further. So, as a retaliation, US imposed 50% tariffs on roughly, I would say, $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. And Canada also responded by announcing retaliatory tariffs. And Prime Minister Mark Carney publicly explained that Canada had walked away because of some of the US demands crossed what Canada considered is sovereign red lines. Now we will talk about those sovereign red lines because that is a very important aspect, because this opens new doors that how these tariffs and trades can be used. In fact, if you look into the history, if you go back into the history, you find that East India Company went to India in 1680. That was for trade. And then they colonized the whole entire country because of the trade. Okay. Now, and then the first industrial revolution started by tariffing and destroying India's textile industry. India's entire textile industry was destroyed just so that United Kingdom's or England's first industrial revolution can be started. That's how it was. Okay. So these things are important. And in this case, what's happening is that President Trump or say United States demand are some pretty weird. Okay. So in the beginning, the tariffs were the immediate triggers, but the sovereignty dispute is what explains why the deal actually collapsed. Because if there is tariff dispute, then you can discuss those things. But when somebody is challenging your sovereignty, you cannot discuss that. Those things cannot be compromised. Why? Because in the past, if you go back to, I would say, late 2024, there were certain things that United States, actually US, hinted at. That was Alberta's separatist movement. And I'm going to get to it. I'm not going to talk in detail about it, but let's first stick to the trade deal, okay? So the question was that finally, what exactly happened that challenged Canada's sovereignty, right? That's the important part. So, according to Mark Carney, the final demand simply touched several areas Canada considered unacceptable. Number one was the future Canadian trade deals. So, according to Prime Minister Mark Carney, US basically changed the language at the last minute. And they used the language that could actually restrict Canada's ability to negotiate future trade agreements with other countries. And this is why I said in the beginning that it was somewhat like the arrangement that US had with Canada. Sorry, not Canada, but Venezuela. Because US is right now focusing on protecting its dollar by bringing the whole entire, or at least attempting to, okay? So I'm just using I would say a simple language so that we understand the picture, okay? By bringing the supply chain, the oil and natural gas, the energy supply chain into the Western Hemisphere. And by putting all these trade restrictions, US still wants to maintain that advantage. When actually, this bringing the energy and oil, all the supply chain to the Western Hemisphere, it will actually give advantage to Canada. Why is that? It's going to give advantage to Canada because Canada is closer to the Arctic. That's number one thing. And with the Arctic sea lane opening, Canada's trade with Asian countries, all these Asian powers, is going to grow. Like India, China, and then lots of, there are South Asian countries, there are lots of Asian countries that require energy, right? So with those with Arctic opening, Arctic summer ice completely melting by 2035, uh, this is going to be advantage Canada, not advantage US. This is why US wanted to actually take the Greenland. It wasn't about just the energy and all that. It was about controlling Canada's supply chain going towards Europe and to Asia. You have to understand that this is not just about this is not about Russia or China. Russia and China are diversion and they cover. This is mainly the whole scheme to take control of Greenland was to restrict Canadian shipping lanes going to Europe and to Asia and other countries. Okay, that's the game here. You have to understand this. Okay, so this is what happened, and now Canada is actively trying to expand trade with what? Europe, India, ASEAN, the Gulf, and other markets. And this is why in my previous videos in the past I have said that there are two countries that can actually that have pretty solid future as far as energy is concerned. One is Canada, other one is Russia. What Russia can provide to the world as far as energy is concerned, Canada can do that to vis-a-vis. Okay, so which means that if Canada does that, then Canada's economy is going to take off on a whole another trajectory. In fact, I think that Canadians have restricted themselves all these years, and I have no idea why. I mean, you are part of G7. You should be dictating the terms to the G7 rather than being the underdog, or I would say more like, I mean, I don't want to use the word, but I think people get it, right? So instead of being somebody's lackey, you got to be that guy. You got to take the charge. But Canadians were quiet up until now. Now Canada is working to diversify all that. So if Canada accepts those agreements, restrictions on those agreements, it would directly undermine Canada's attempt to reduce its dependence on the US. Why? Because up to, I would say, 95% of US oil, crude oil, it's imported from Canada. And 85% of that comes from Alberta alone. Okay? So these things actually matter. And Canada actually viewed this thing as basically the basic question for Canada was, who controls Canadian foreign economic policy? Now think about it this way, another way. Like if US had taken over Greenland, then what? Then who was going to control Canada's foreign and economic policies then? Right? So now you understand the game behind the Greenland. The China and Russia, all this was just a cover. It was mainly to control Canadian shipping lanes so that Canada doesn't get out of hand. Because Canada is the only blocker in America's energy game. If US wants to be the energy boss, then how US can be energy boss when your neighboring country is the biggest energy producer and has direct access to the shortest shipping lane? Now you see the game? All right, let's move to the next point. Okay, now French language and cultural policies. Now this is where the hypocrisy shows up, but there is the angle to it, the monetary angle to it too. So US also objected to policies affecting French language requirements and Canadian cultural protections. Okay, these rules basically can impose additional requirements on American companies that are operating in Canada. So US therefore actually views some of them as non-tariff trade barriers. What does that even mean? See, in simple terms, whenever a product is sold, then what happens is that there's certain provinces in Canada, they have French language requirement that you have to label your products in French. not in English. So 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 what happens here? So American companies, their grief or their issue is that if they go and label separately dedicated for one particular Canadian province, then they have to pay extra money for all that. But they are okay if there is uniformity. And this kind of issue was raised by other service provider companies as well, like Netflix, Amazon, and all that as well. So this is another thing that US raised with Canada, and Canada has problem with that. Canada is saying that these are our rules. If you want to trade here, then you have to follow those rules. And for me, my view is that yes, because America's language is English, then why are you actually putting everywhere you put Spanish in there? Oh, for English one press one, and for Espanol press two. Now I don't have problem with the Spanish or anything, but when you start to compare the two, then it becomes hypocrisy, right? Why? Because for Canada you want it English, but everywhere else in your own country you put two languages, when actually Spanish speaking people are not that much in population actually, and lots of them are actually illegals too. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that Canada has problem with. Okay, so this is another aspect of it. And once you start to uh, say oblige one thing, like for example, let's say French language and cultural policies, then what happens is that this can hurt Canada's sovereignty, and it can create actually internal rift too within the country itself. Why? Because then the people who speak French, they may say that, hey, what's wrong with this country now all of a sudden? Right? Just like Alberta was raised, a hint was given in 2024. Okay, a hint was given that US may support Alberta separatists movement. Okay, so then there will be another trigger point too. Then French language itself will become another trigger point, which can be used as a leverage down the line. Like, in other countries there have been regime changes or attempts have been made. You see those Gen Z protests and all that, right? Those things can be done over there too. So first, how do you do it? You first create this system by putting these type of conditions in the trade. And then use that to your advantage to manipulate the government for further demands, for them to approve the further demands as well. Okay, the next thing was autos and industrial protection. What Canada is saying is that, hey, we gotta give substantially, you have to treat our vehicles, automobiles, better. You gotta give us substantially better treatment, mainly the automobile industry. Okay, now and certain products at the last minute, US government actually increased the tariffs on those things, and Canada therefore believed the economic concessions being offered were insufficient compared with what US wanted Canada to give up. So this was once again, this is again a unfair trade deal, where I think it's more so to do with President Trump's own personality, maybe trying to show off that, hey, I get the best deals or whatever, win-win thing. But reality is this. Okay, US concern as far as automobile is concerned, it's also legitimate. Why? Because Canada has been allowing lots and lots of Chinese electric vehicles and all that in their market. Okay, and what Chinese have been doing is, over the years, that they go and set up their companies in other countries, and then what they do is they use that market to export their vehicles into American market. Okay, So this is why in every trade agreement there is a clause that's called the country of origin. Yes, company may belong to Chinese, company may be in Canada, but where this company or where this product or company actually originated from, or where it's originally from? That's the clause. That clause actually covers that part. So right now the full entire the deal or paper is not available for me to look at, but I believe uh, US probably brought that up, that clause, and with that clause, uh, Chinese won't be able to export their vehicles into American market. So I will have to still look into that part. But the disagreement, mainly the one of the disagreements was the automobile industry. Okay, so the question now is, after all this, what happens now? Is Canada actually trying to break away from the US? Well, see, like I said earlier, that Canada has already uh, stopped being that lackey. Canada has realized its potential, and it sees that it has full access, is going to have full access to the shortest shipping lane, that is Arctic shipping lane. All that Canada has to do is have good terms with the Russians and Asian countries and Europeans and all that. And Canada also sees that there is a very huge market in the Europe that Canada can use. Now you see the game. Earlier, US supported Russia-Ukraine war behind the scenes so that Russians can get out of European market altogether. So US can then sell its natural gas and crude, all that, to Europe to take over, to replace the Russian products or Russian oil and energy with its own energy and stuff. Okay, but now there is a plot twist in this whole plan, and the plot twist is Canada. Why? Why it's beneficial for Canada? Because Canada is way closer to Europe than US, closer as in the supply chain wise. So if Canada will provide the energy to the Europe, it will be cheaper. Yes, it may not be as cheap as what Russians are providing, but it will be cheaper than what US is providing at. Okay, so Canada will start to challenge the American market in European Union. Okay, and then Canada already, like for example, has signed the uranium deal, $2 billion uranium deal with India. So, and then Canada is also going to sign the energy deals with India as well, and to work in the Arctic as well. Not just India. I'm using India as an example because these things are recent. Okay, you can verify what I'm saying. So Canada is diversifying its exports. Canada, Prime Minister Mark Carney went to India. He was on many visits. So he went and he discussed his relationship and wanted to work with all these countries over there. Now, if Canada diversifies its energy export especially, energy, nuclear, all these things, and takes over one of the largest markets in the world, then who do you think is challenged with that? And whose Monroe Doctrine is getting challenged at this point? Right? So the whole thing that was used, it was because of all these reasons. Okay, so this is it for this video, guys. I will talk to you guys in another video. Take care.